Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not-so-distant past. The jumping-off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. In today's episode, I talked to Simon J. James, host and producer of the up-and-coming podcast, Achtung History. Now, I found Simon when I was looking for new history podcasts to listen to, and when I saw the name Achtung History, I was certain the host would have a German accent. When I heard his lovely British accent, I was drawn in, being the self-proclaimed Anglophile that I am. If the voice drew me in, then the writing and his narration kept me there. Simon J. James, also known as the Berlin tour guide, loves Berlin so much, he moved there from Yorkshire, England, and started a tour guide business. His tours are not your run-of-the-mill, though. Simon dives deep into the research to curate his one-of-a-kind history tours of Berlin. Simon has guided entrepreneurs, celebrities, and royalty around Berlin since 2014. According to his website, theberlintourguide.com, Simon goes beyond shallow history, taking you on a storytelling journey through the secrets of Berlin's history. Inside stories of drama and intrigue alongside the largest historic events in Berlin's history, an approach that is apparent in his podcast. Simon J. James, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I start each interview out with the same question, and we're just going to get right off to the races. What's your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
Do you know, this was something when you sent me the email and asked me to do this interview, I actually spent a very, very long time thinking about it. It's really taken me a long time to work through and think about what I wanted to talk about, in particular in respects to the fact that I find myself having a very, very broad area of interest. So I started to ask myself, why do I have such a broad area of interest? What is the springboard that launches me into the rabbit holes that I seem to fall down so often? And I realized it's the thing that I talk about most often. And it's very simply where I live. It's the city that I adore, because it takes me on so many different journeys that not necessarily are local to where I am, but it takes me across a country. And therefore, the topic that I prefer most to talk about, the history that I am constantly in love with, is the history of Berlin. And I realize that's a very broad and umbrella place to begin, but it really does sort of narrow down into the idea that the city that I love, Berlin, is so incredible and keeps me going because of all its little connections that it builds all the time.
I know this might put you on the spot, and it's a really broad question, but can you give us a little kind of synopsis of the history of Berlin?
Yes and no is the easy answer to that, to make things even more complicated. Berlin is, in history, it's not a continuation like some cities may have been. Let's take, for example, London is very much a continuation of history. It's never really been, let's say, conquered as such. The Romans founded it, it was abandoned, etc. And then the Normans established a stronghold then, and then the history has remained fairly linear throughout. Berlin is quite different. The city of Berlin itself began with, we don't even really know to begin with. The very beginnings of Berlin itself are very much in murky waters. There was a lot of small fishing settlements around here. They competed with one another over time for prominence, and it was also one point on the outer reaches of Christianity before the Slavic pagans to the east. But the thing that I think really defines Berlin's history is the fact that it's always been really a divide. It's been what we think today as looking at its more recent history. It was torn between the Cold War. It sat on the crossroads of East and West. And through all of these things, they've added to a very rich texture of the city. But Berlin, in essence, is a rebellious outpost that is its own place, its own identity, that hasn't tried to really conform with any one particular style. It's a wonderful amalgamation of many different places all coming together in a huge city. And it's got a really quite just incredible energy to it that very few cities I personally find can compete with.
So you don't have a German accent. You
No.
are obviously from England.
I am.
Are you German?
No, I'm English. I grew up in England, but from a very early age, through a musical exchange with an orchestra that I used to be part of, had an exchange with Germany, and I fell in love with Germany from about the age of 11 or 12.
Oh, wow, that's young.
And slowly that connection led me to explore a little places farther afield. Initially, it was to the far west of Germany that I first visited. And then on one of those trips to the far west, I took a train and came to Berlin and never sort of wanted to leave, which is why I live here, and why, for me, the history of Germany and Berlin is so much has been a big part and is a big part of my life, and why I'd like to think I'm somewhat of an expert in it.
I think you are. Tell us a little bit about your journey and how you did end up in Berlin and what it is that you do now. And I want to say I've been listening to your podcast ever since yesterday, because I try to do a deep dive before I interview somebody, whatever their platform is.
Yes.
Hitler's Horses. Oh my God. Do you do the writing?
Yeah, I do all of it.
Oh my word. Have you published a book?
I haven't. I'm sitting on a few things at the moment that I'm debating whether or not I'm going to release them as podcasts or as books.
Why not everything? I am in love with your writing. It was high intrigue. It had everything. It wasn't just a history podcast, and you have a great voice. So it's very rare that somebody who is a writer can actually narrate their own writing. That doesn't happen a lot. Anyways, I'm a fan. How did you become, what is it, the Berlin tour guide?
Yes, that's correct. I arrived in Berlin to live here permanently about 6.5 years ago. And I've always had a passion for storytelling on top of my passion for history. My degree at university wasn't a degree in history as such, but it was a degree in film. So the two elements of history and storytelling have been a big part of my own identity and what I've loved doing. And since my first visit to the city of Berlin, it was the history that captured me. So I visited first, I don't know how long ago now, quite a long time ago. And I just remember that it was bitterly cold. It was one of the coldest winters they'd ever had on record. It was minus 20 something degrees Celsius. And the city, despite that, was so beautiful. The skies were blue, the architectural styling of the place, the neoclassical columns, all just looked amazing. And at that point, I decided that I had to live in Berlin. So I went back to England, went back to university. I studied in Bristol, which is in itself a fantastic city. And I left university possibly at one of the worst times that one could, which was during the end of the middle of the last recession. And there wasn't a lot of options. Myself and a lot of my course colleagues, we had to start taking whatever jobs we could. I know a lot of people who wanted to go and specialize in certain aspects of film, be it writing, etc. And it was very difficult for anybody because there wasn't the opportunities. For myself, I took up some odd jobs. I did some work in filming with another passion of mine, which is motorsport. And ultimately, many years later, I got fed up of it, and I decided to sell everything I owned and just follow the dream, which was follow to Berlin. And I arrived here. I knew so much of the history already because it had been part of my dissertation at university was a study of pre and post fall of the Berlin Wall attitudes and reflections and iconography. So I just fell into being a tour guide and enjoyed every moment of it because you got to meet new people. And the thing that I've always specified with being a tour guide is that if you repeat facts, nobody's going to remember anything. But if you can give people the stories, the one-liners, you can create springboards that they will remember the rest of the story. Yeah. They only need that starting point to be able to remember so much more, and they can go away and tell their friends. And that's what I've loved about it. Of course, naturally, in the last year or so, tour guiding has not been a particularly great
Can I just interject because, and this is one of the other reasons why I was so intrigued by you, is I too am a tour guide. I live in a National Historic Landmark District in Colorado. The town is called Georgetown. And so I just love history. I love talking about it. I'm not a scholar. I kind of fell in love with history at university. I had a teacher that I took every semester, and she would do that. She would come in and tell you history like a story. I was totally sold, and I guess I've already kind of always had that propensity. Anyways, I'm a storyteller. My degree is actually in writing. So I too was in the same quandary when COVID happened, and I shut my business down this past season. And that's when I started my podcast. Is that when you started yours as well, or?
In part, yes. I'd actually begun working on the podcast last year when I'd actually taken a sabbatical anyway from tour guiding. I've been working a lot, and I decided that actually what I wanted to do was focus on doing some writing and focusing on, rather, instead of working so much, that to follow the writing side as well. And during that year, I happened to stumble upon, can't remember exactly what it was, but I stumbled upon a name, and it was one of those rabbit hole moments that I just tumbled and tumbled down. And that became that name presented me with a question: is why do we not know about this? Why do we not know about this person? And through many, many weeks and months of research, I started to build a picture, and that picture eventually formed itself into the writing for the first podcast, for the first series, He Who Holds the Devil, and a study into Hans Globke, the man who was the lawyer that effectively wrote the Nuremberg laws that persecuted so horrendously during the Nazi regime. And he was a man who got away with it. And I couldn't quite fathom how this person was allowed to get away with it. So I was sitting on it, preparing for a new season of tour guiding to begin, and I thought I would sit on it, I'll record it, I'll have it all set up, and then I'll use it as promotion for the tour guiding business to enhance the website and such. And then COVID hit. The business, of course, naturally died, and my fiance said, why don't you just release it? So I did. I started releasing it, and there was, I think with doing that, it awoke a passion within me to focus a lot more on the writing and the storytelling, and combine it with the history to keep going with the podcast. I work most weeks, 5 days a week, on producing new podcasts to keep going. So it really was the current situation that pushed me into doing the podcasting.
Do you do all German history, or do you do
No, so I predominantly focus upon Prussian history. The reason I don't focus upon German history as a whole is because it gets infinitely more complicated. The idea of Germany in German history, we say, begins in 9 AD, when the Germanic tribes first united together and defeated the Roman armies. at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. But Germany doesn't exist as a physical concept until really the unification of Germany in 1871. So prior to that, during, for example, the Holy Roman Empire that existed from the late 9th century until Napoleon disbanded it in 1806, that was a collection of bishopdoms, of fiefs, of dukedoms, of small independent kingdoms that just creates a really rich fabric. There was a wonderful book by the former curator of the British Museum, Neil MacGregor, who really explored beautifully through different topics what it meant to be German and what is German history. And the reality is that German history is a history of different areas working together in skills, but there isn't something as such that you could classify until 1871 as the German nation. So you can't really say, are you an expert in German history, because of the fact that Bavaria has its own completely different timeline until 1871 to Prussia, which existed in the north. So it becomes extremely complicated. If you take, for example, Queen Victoria of Britain, her husband was Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and that was a German area. And it was an area that was infinitely divided within itself. So it started of Saxe, was divided into Coburg and Gotha, and it becomes this pyramid scheme, effectively, of nations. So the history of Germany in itself is so complicated. So I choose to focus a bit more simply on Prussia and Berlin, which have a not quite easier, but it's a more focused historical story. But in particular, the area that fascinates me about Berlin is how Berlin came into being. It went so quickly from a backwater capital to the capital of an empire, and became the powerhouse of Europe that made the old kingdoms, the Britain and France, really, really quake, because it became so powerful so quickly. And it spawned a great wealth that then became the wonderful 1920s in Berlin, the decadent periods. So my history is predominantly focused around Berlin and Prussia.
What is the one thing that you want my listeners to know about Berlin?
Good question. I think the one thing that I would have to say that I'd like people to know more about Berlin is that Berlin in the last 100 years has really garnered a reputation as a party city. From the 1920s, that is very much revered for its cabarets and such, through to the 1990s until today as a big scene of techno and clubbing. And what I often find is when people come to Berlin, often now they miss something. And what they miss is that Berlin was once the center of education and enlightenment. A lot of people presume that because of the German history from World War I and World War II, that Berlin and Prussia were this militaristic area of boots marching up and down and Hitler salutes, etc. But Berlin itself really was one of the most amazingly liberal and enlightened areas where there was a huge focus on education. Berlin had one of the greatest success rates for children in education. They had, in the end of the 19th century, they had over 96% of the children in Berlin were in education, which is incredible to think about, because if you compare that to somewhere like England, you could flip that on its head. 96% of children in England weren't in education. Berlin had an incredible university in the Friedrich Wilhelm University that became the University of Berlin, that is today's Humboldt University, founded by the fantastic Humboldt brothers, Alexander von Humboldt gives his name to many counties in the United States and many different species of animals. It was home to some of the greatest museums and collections. And it really is such an incredible cultural center that you can walk into so many different museums on one ticket and see some of the most incredible pieces that are explained in a beautiful way. And it's so accessible. It's really accessible. to wander around and see incredible buildings that other places I always feel a little bit lacking. Berlin is a central place of education that changed really the course of Europe at one point because of its incredible institutions that eventually led to people like Max Planck and Albert Einstein studying or lecturing here and really pushing the way in sciences, mathematics, etc. So there's so much deep, rich educational history that is worth exploring, as well as the history that often is more prominent due to, for example, the Second World War, due to media and such that allows us through films and photographs to have a more visual approach. That's really what I always think about Berlin, is that people need to remember that it wasn't just the Hitler regime or the First World War, or the dancing of the 20s. It was a city like none other. It really was for education and enlightenment.
Who knew? And you're absolutely right that my understanding of Germany, period, or its history is very rooted in the wars.
It is. I think that's the same for so many people.
And it is unfortunate in a way. I think it's an important history to remember, but at the same time, I think there's a lot that is lost in that quick association, maybe. Do you speak German?
I wish I can read German, but I can't speak it. I'm sort of the reverse of most people who can speak it but can't read it. But it's purely because I spend so much time reading old newspapers to gather my research, or to gather strange little stories which are otherwise somewhat forgotten. I spend a lot of time reading the old Germanic fracture script that I can read fairly well. I still have to translate most things just to be sure I'm translating in my head is correct, but when it comes to speaking it, no, I do struggle. But that's also down to the fact that Berlin is an extremely multicultural city.
You do your tours in English?
Oh, I do everything in English, yes.
Interesting. That's interesting. I was wondering about that. Are you still doing tours? Have you done any tours this year?
I've done a handful. One was actually for a client, and then I decided that, again, with a little bit of a prod, I decided to do a free tour to try and address aspects of Berlin's history that otherwise people wouldn't explore. If you come to a lot of cities in Europe, let's say as a student, for example, more often than not, you'll end up doing a free walking tour in the city, and it will be with a certain company. And they will take you on routes. But what I found in my passing by of these tours is a lot of the information is sort of like a Chinese whispers of information. One tour guide read it once, and then the next tour guide was trained off of them speaking, and the next one. And slowly that information has become a little bit fragmented and predominantly wrong. But also with that, a lot of these companies, they do the same tours. They in a way, they give the people what they want. They want to see where Hitler's bunker was. They want to see the Berlin Wall. They want to see Checkpoint Charlie. So I decided this just before the second lockdown came into being. I decided to do not per se an alternative tour, but rather to do tours of the important historical sites that wouldn't fall onto those routes. So I did a tour of the old historic city centre of Berlin, which we're slowly getting parts of it back. Things are being rebuilt. It's lovely to see some incredible buildings that were destroyed either through the war or through the communist period and not fitting in with a new ideology, and to take people through the stories. And the Only Ghost Story of Berlin falls into that mark. And then more recently, I did a tour that focused on two things. It focused on the communist history of Berlin outside of the post-Second World War period, so that the earlier communist history, and beer, the history of beer and how it is a very interesting tool to look into the development of the city through types of beer that people drank, through rising volumes of beer produced, different types of beer that were produced, and why certain types of beer went out of existence. And I offered those to people in Berlin, because I think it's important to get people in their own city out as much as it is to get tourists in and learning about the
Sure.
city. So those were both wonderful little forays back into tour guiding. But other than that, it has been a year that I have focused predominantly on podcasting.
So you're in lockdown again?
Soft lockdown. We're bars and restaurants are closed, takeaway is open, shops are limited in how many people that can go in. It's not as bad as the first one, but cases are a little bit worse than the first lockdown at the moment. So we're just existing.
We should be in lockdown. It's horrible here right now, and we have this president who's denying the fact that he lost.
We can't avoid it. It's all over
It's so
the news.
humiliating.
Yeah,
But the truth of the matter is that half of the United States are aligned, not half, maybe a little bit less than half, but are, aligned with his, if you want to call it a philosophy. And I constantly think about the Nazis and the evolution of the Nazis and compare it to, there's a lot of elements of what has gone on in the United States and other countries too, even England. It makes me understand how the Nazis and Hitler came into power. The only saving grace for us, I think, is that Trump is not as smart as Hitler was.
I think I would agree with that. Yeah, it's we can always say, a very good friend of mine says hindsight is 2020, and it's easier to look later on at where you could have stopped things than it is to address them at the time that they're happening. But we do have the benefit of certain aspects of history that we can draw parallels between that will allow us to understand our governments themselves better as well.
Where do we see this history? And this is a good opportunity for you to help us to see a Berlin that you see, perhaps. Where do we see this history in pop culture?
Oh, with Berlin, I think absolutely everywhere. I think you'd be surprised, really, how often it pops up in popular culture. So, for example, I was at lunchtime today, I was watching Scrubs, if you remember the old TV show Scrubs.
Yeah. Sure.
And the Nina song 99 Love Balloons came on, 99 Love Balloons. And that's a very important piece of popular culture about Berlin. It's talking about sending balloons over the wall. It's about dropping these little pieces of silver to interrupt messages, etc. One small piece of pop culture. But also there's really the pop culture in Berlin, and the two really come together very, very often. And most times you might not even realize it. An example springs to mind in the Mockingjay films. I've forgotten what they're called.
The Hunger Games?
The Hunger Games, thank you.
Okay.
In German, they're called Mockingjay. In the Hunger Games, which I believe, not having really seen too much of the films or reading the books, it's all about this totalitarian state. And there's a scene in it where there's a crowd gathered and they're protesting in a big open space. And behind them is this large rising building. And the building that rises behind them is actually the largest fascist building we have in Berlin. It's the old Tempelhof Airport, which is actually just behind me as I record this. I live next door to the old runways. So you get little snippets of how Berlin is used in popular culture through quite often its architecture. In that case, it's used because it's totalitarian, it's dominating. Architecture that was built to make people feel small. So often in popular culture, they use the cityscape of Berlin, or you can fast forward to Atomic Blonde, quite a fantastic film that came out a few years ago, which was predominantly set in Berlin, and use a lot of very, very clever little references to its history throughout. And I think Berlin just captures something, especially when they go historically, because it's got this grit and grime to it, because of the East-West divide. And also, I think, because people idealized this sense of being and sense of liberation that Berlin provided. When the Berlin Wall came down, people were euphoric. The wall was a symbol of tyranny. People today still will go to see pieces of the Berlin Wall to have a picture with it because it means something. And films can often use, or music can use references to Berlin to really try and create a sense of liberation, of what it means. Bruce Springsteen shot a music video in Berlin very, very shortly after the Berlin Wall came down. He was also the man who held, I believe it still is, the largest concert in history in East Berlin when the regime was trying to appear cool, when really the regime was these old, bitter white men who try to keep the semblance of a...
Sounds like the United States.
It comes around. It's people pretending to let go of the shackles of the past, but really they're trying to keep it alive through creating a veneer of change. But in the case of Berlin, that change did arrive.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that change has always also been accepted as coming part and parcel with David Hasselhoff.
David Hasselhoff?
There's this sort of illusion that David Hasselhoff is popular in Germany because he was in Berlin around the time of the wall fall and New Year's, and he appeared in a cherry picker crane at the Berlin Wall singing "Everybody's Looking for Freedom" and tried to cement himself within the popular culture of legacy of Berlin.
Oh,
but
I didn't know that. I did not know.
It's very cringy.
I don't associate him with that, but now I'm gonna go look. Though I have to find it.
I've just spread the Hasselhoff a little bit further and done the opposite to what I intend to.
Well, history is a funny thing. We can't control how the future is going to look at historical events or even how we look at them today, but history has always been a touchstone of the narrative of everything and everybody for me. We link back to obviously whatever your platform is. So in your case, it would be your website and your podcast. And I see you can pretty much listen to your podcast anywhere where people listen to podcasts.
But pretty much, and amazingly many, many platforms I had no idea I was on as well.
And you also are on Patreon. You also have how does your Patreon work?
My Patreon works predominantly as if people wish to support it. I do believe quite often that history should be accessible to all, so I don't like putting things as such behind paywalls. So how I work the Patreon is that it's more sort of let's say a tip or a donation.
Yeah.
However, when I record episodes, I generally put between 20 and 40 hours of work into each episode. So when I do release something for Patreon, it's normally just an informal chat where I go over those bits and ideas that I wanted to fit in, but they didn't quite work with the narrative of the podcast. So Patreon, there's many tiers. I think the lowest one is just a singular euro, just to try and make it accessible to all.
Yeah, and you don't have commercials, I noticed.
No, I don't.
Is that something that you are planning on keeping it that way, or do you look to monetize potential? I'm asking, this is more from a podcast point of view.
I would prefer to keep it without advertisements.
Yeah.
I would prefer to keep it so that it's not, the narratives that I'm building aren't broken by a sudden pop-up, and try to encourage, if people do enjoy the podcast, to think about giving something as little as €1 a month through Patreon to keep it advertisement free.
Right.
I'd much rather keep it that way.
That's what I'm trying to do as well. This is something I've thought about for 2 years, and I always thought, it would be so cool to do a podcast where people just, regular people talk about their favorite history. Obviously, you are not a regular person when it comes to history, but I, talked to, my first 3 interviews was my friend who runs a Hotel de Paris here in town. He's the executive director, so he's a historian. But, it's just that using history as a springboard to conversation. And And then because of COVID, like I said, I was able to start this podcast, and I've gotten into a routine with it, and I want to keep doing it. But like you, I don't want to monetize it through commercials either.
I would like to keep it commercial free, and I've contemplated that I am going to have to look at doing something other than tour guiding in the future because the business I feel is gone. So I've contemplated even then doing whatever I can to keep the podcast going, but that may mean having, if there isn't sponsorship as such, to reduce the amount of episodes I produce. So I go back to doing it as a hobby rather than as I treat it at the moment as more of a full-time job in
Yeah,
research. But it doesn't feel like work. It never does.
it doesn't. I know. I wish I could do this for a living, and I'm like you. I need to, I'm a freelancer, and I need to find jobs to do. Uh, yeah, that's. But you have a book. You have books. You have everything that you put into it. You put way more into your podcasts than I do. And that's not to sell my podcast short, but I can see it being a writer, all the work that you put behind it, the history and the way you connect all the dots and your stories. And I was just before we started, I was listening to your Halloween episode.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that was a brilliant story. I thought the
Well,
whole
thank you very
episode was
much.
actually going to be the story, which I was like, oh, yeah, this is cool. But then you do end up getting to the history, and I hadn't, the historical narrative, but
Thank you very much. The Halloween episode was a really fun one. That is really pretty much Berlin's only ghost story. For a city that has seen so much and been devastated in so many different ways throughout history, that's Berlin's only ghost story. The palace that the ghost supposedly floated through, either was the original one was destroyed many years ago. Then the one that replaced it was destroyed by the communist regime at the end of the war, and they lost that connection. But that palace is now back. We've rebuilt it in its facade, and it's now crowning Museum Island, the UNESCO World Heritage Site at the center of Berlin. And for Halloween, with the palace should be reopening in the next few weeks again to the public for the first time. It was something that I felt would be special to do, but it's also because it was a ghost that supposedly haunted the Hohenzollern dynasty, which is one of my sort of weak spots too in Berlin's history that I always fall down to. I love wandering the palaces of Potsdam near Berlin, where the monarchs used to live and where supposedly the ghost haunted, and going to the graves of the great King Frederick II. And the Hohenzollerns, I feel, is something very special to understand. Not in a positive light. There was certainly some large negative aspects to that, especially Kaiser Wilhelm II. They were some interesting characters through it that really inspired me to try and get that Halloween episode out and to combine the storytelling with a little bit more of an ethereal atmosphere with sound effects. And it's something I really enjoyed. I try not to work on podcasts at the weekend. I try and have a bit of time off, but for that one, I made an exception to spend a little bit more time editing the sounds in.
yeah. Well, we have a lot in common, the tours and then the podcast and the storytelling. And I just immediately, when I heard your voice and started listening to the podcast, when I reached out to you, I knew like, oh, I want this guy on my podcast. He's got a really cool, yeah. Where are you from in England? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the north, in the county of Yorkshire, but I
Oh,
grew up
okay.
in the countryside.
We were supposed to go there. We had tickets. England is like to me the motherland. That's where my ancestors are from, southern in Hampshire, a little town called Meganstoke. I traced their kind of lineage back there. So I am an Anglophile. I have to say I'm a self-confessed, and we love going to England. So we were going to go for almost a month this last time.
Oh
So
wow.
excited. We were going to go north, which I really hadn't spent too much time in the north, and we were going to go to Scotland and York and go see Hadrian's Wall, and
Yeah.
that didn't happen. So
York is a fantastic place. York is a place that I hold special. It's full of stories. It's got an insanely vibrant history and some devilishly wicked words. They have a street called Whitmer Whatmer Gate, which is it's a very short street, or the Shambles, which has now become somewhat a Harry Potter mess. Gorgeous, gorgeous city. And if you enjoy ghost stories, it's absolutely full of them.
So why don't you tell us about your podcast? Tell us where we can find you.
So my podcast is, at the moment, it's released weekly. You can find it on every major platform and many small platforms as well, from Apple to Spotify, Radio Public, Overcast, etc. The idea behind the podcast, which is called Achtung History, is that it is a blend of storytelling and history. I like to open the episodes with a narrative that builds a picture and then take you back into the history. So in not quite up to a year yet, but we're 38 episodes in with a couple of series. The first series is He Who Holds the Devil, which I alluded to earlier on, which is the investigation in a documentary style into Hans Globke, who worked for the Prussian and the Reich's Ministry of the Interior during the Nazi period and was responsible for the commentaries on the Nuremberg laws that helped the Nazis to persecute the Jewish people. But not only that, he was also a main purporter of ethnic cleansing in what is today Czechia, the Czech Republic, in Lithuania, Latvia, the Netherlands, Belgium, and many other locations. And then, amazingly, still managed to become the most powerful person in post-World War II West Germany. He became the shadowy figure behind Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, who pulled all the strings. So that was our series 1. Season 2 was a full narrative, but really was a passion project of mine. Last year, I spent the year writing a book, of which my iPad is currently resting on top of, which is about as much use as it gets at the moment. During that writing that book, I stumbled upon a story in the newspaper about the murder of a poor girl in 1929 in Berlin. And I went to the state archives, found the police files, and reconstructed a few weeks in August 1929 into the events. So in that podcast, which is called The Watcher, it's an 8-part series that every conversation in it is reconstructed from the original police transcripts from 1929. And with that, I've also tried to build a picture of what was going on in the city at the time, which is quite incredible.
That's the other thing I wanted to tell you, that I love your sound effects. Like the one about Hitler's horses, you portray these conversations that actually happened, and then everything changes and it sounds like these conversations are taking place on a phone.
Yes. Yeah. So I try to distinguish when I have in the more standalone episodes, when I have people talking or I'm quoting a lot of the time, I will put an effect on just so that it's clear that it's a quote. I don't like saying quote, end quote. It's a weird thing that we actually don't really do in English. It's just a little quirk that I found was useful to break my narrative from the actual quotes, which often is I predominantly use a lot of Albert Speer quotes because of the fact that he was so well written of the time. Amongst the series, which also includes series on Wernher von Braun, the man who put American NASA into space. There's a 6-episode series on him. There's a lot of standalone ones as well, where it looks into more quirkier, singular episodes, so you don't have to invest a lot of time. They're designed to be a little bit more either off-cuff or, as the current one, The Hunt for Hitler's Horses, is a little bit more investigative.
Yeah. Well, I think you have a great product, and I think that I don't know, somebody should hire you like Spotify did with Joe Rogan. I mean, so you're so
That'd be,
talented. You're real,
thank
really,
you.
you are. I mean, I know I keep gushing and I sound like a fan. Well, I guess I am.
It's certainly
So that
something that I would love to pursue further. It's my dream to be able to keep doing research and spend my days in dusty archives.
just in the rabbit holes,
Yeah,
coming
it's
up for air to tell people what you found out.
there's a weird sense of happiness and pride when you can walk out of somewhere and go, I'm potentially the first person to know this fact or this
Mm,
little snippet in 100 or so years.
sure. Oh, yeah.
It's a little pat on the back. It's even if it is for that one moment slightly selfish, but then I turn it into a podcast and broadcast it. So
Oh, yeah. That's awesome.
I love going to the old markets, the flea markets, the floor market, and finding most of my collection of German literature is actually I've paid perhaps €1 for
Oh,
most of the
wow.
books. So it's very, a lot of it's very cheap. I have an original celebration book from the wedding anniversary of the Kaiser,
Oh,
but I
wow.
also it's strange things that you pick up that most people don't realize there's a bit of worth to. Sometimes you think you've really found a nugget of information. And in Berlin and Prussia, there was once a great king. It was called Frederick II, and he's one of the only kings whose statue still remains. Most were melted down at the end of the Second World War, or even during the Second World War for their mineral wealth. And a long time ago, they produced these little pocket books. I'll hold it. It's
No,
about
show me it because okay. I'll take a screenshot of it. Okay. It's
it's
actually
only
a
about
beautiful little pamphlet.
it's gorgeous. It's called a miniature bibliothèque. It's only about 2.5 inches across, about I don't know 4 inches tall. And in here, this little tiny little biography of the great king Frederick II, or Friedrich II. Um, it alluded to this incredible little piece of information, which is that completely benign in all of the great things that he did. It's completely benign, but it just tells you that Frederick II liked his coffee with mustard.
That is crazy.
It's crazy. It's just one of those absolutely. You
Yeah.
wouldn't think that somebody would actually even today enjoy a coffee with mustard, but he did. And it's one of those little facts that you become a little treasure. And then one day you just happen to go into Twitter with all your Twitter storians and find somebody else knew it, and it annoys you because you thought you were sitting on that. But it's one of those little treasures that you like to hold on. That make also they make characters in history real
Yeah.
when so often they sit on pedestals. They were just real people. And Frederick II was, for me, one of my favorite characters because he was a man who he did know love, but his father stole love from him when he executed his best friend. And Frederick spent most of his life then either he was married, but his wife lived on one side of Berlin and he lived on the other side of Berlin. He spent his summers in a beautiful small palace. It was only 12 rooms and it's still there today. It's called Sanssouci. And all he wanted to do was when he died was to be buried with his dogs on the top terrace of his vineyard, which naturally, okay, just to have a vineyard is quite nice to have. But such a man who was known and idealized. The Nazis absolutely adored him. They turned him into a film hero multiple times. But he was a man who was of reason. And when he died, he wanted to be buried on his top terrace. So therefore, the person who succeeded him, his nephew, had him buried somewhere completely else,
Oh,
completely in a different spot, until the fall of the Berlin Wall, when in I think it was 1991, so 2 years after the fall of the wall, there was a large ceremony, and he was finally buried on the top terrace of his palace of Sanssouci, roughly 204 years after he died.
oh my
He finally
word.
made it where he wanted to
So
be.
what time, I was going to ask you, what time period was he?
He ruled as King of Prussia from 1740 to 1786.
Wow, that's a great story.
And he's the person you have in Pennsylvania. There is a couple of towns named after. There's actually, I think, there's a shopping mall called the Prince of Prussia, which is named after his younger brother, Prince Heinrich, who trained a lot of the American revolutionary forces in Revolutionary War. He ruled in the 18th century, and it took 204 years for him to be buried where he wanted to be.
So who was behind the burying him 200 and some years later?
When Frederick was initially buried, he was buried in the bottom of a church called the Garrisonkirche in Potsdam, alongside his father. During the Second World War, there was an operation to remove his casket because it was sort of an iconic place to visit, and the Nazis didn't want to get it damaged, so they removed it to a salt mine. And at the end of the Second World War, it was removed from the salt mine and taken to the Hohenzollern Castle in southwest Germany, where it stayed in a crypt there. And when the wall fell, the cities of Berlin, the state of Brandenburg, and the Hohenzollern family, the descendants, came together and arranged for Frederick to finally be buried. It's a beautiful little grave. It's just a stone in the floor that says Friedrich der Große. That's it. Simple, without pomp and circumstance, just
how he
nice
wanted
little
it.
spot. Exactly how he wanted it to be. And it's
Right.
a beautiful little spot that people leave potatoes on, because he introduced the potato to Prussia. So people still go today and put a little, as we'd say in English, we put a spud on his grave.
Uh-huh. Wow.
He's absolutely fascinating man, and a man who liked mustard in his coffee.
Liked mustard.
I don't know. I haven't tried.
It kind of makes me want to try it. I kind of want to try it now.
I keep thinking of trying it, but then
what kind of mustard would it have been? Do you think it would have been like?
I think it would have been a heavy grain mustard.
Okay.
Sort of a thick mustard. Probably not a bright yellow hot dog mustard.
I'm gonna try it. Was there anything else? I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but was there anything else?
I would say that if anybody wants to reach out to me, if they're interested in the podcast, or they themselves have a rabbit hole for me to fall down, also I'm always happy to speak with people on Twitter and Instagram and such. Conversations over history are, I think, exceptionally important. People can be very divided on opinions, but history is something that we can go away and read facts about and build stories and unite in as well, to try and learn a little bit as well.
Well put. And where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Achtung History, or my website, theberlintourguide.com/Achtung History. There is a Facebook page as well, which is Achtung History Podcast, where I post a few updates, but not so much. The main platforms for myself is Twitter and Instagram.
Perfect. Simon J. James, thanks for your time today and for talking to us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, great. Take care, Simon.
You too. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. There you have it, folks. Simon J. James coming at you all the way from Berlin. Be sure to check out his podcast, Achtung History, and his website, theberlintourguide.com. Thanks so much for listening in. Have a great week.